I'm going to move on to the second question for you, David. So this is more on the broader picture of code implementation beyond monitoring. So we know that even for countries that have adopted decent laws to give effect to the code, ultimately the inappropriate marketing can only be restricted with proper enforcement within the country. Enforcement is lagging in most countries, even those countries with code-based laws, and that has been pointed out again and again. How can we mobilize countries to enforce? And can you share some concrete examples if there are any?
You're absolutely right. We have many countries around the world that have, on paper, good legislation in place, and that number grows, every year. We've had success in that. But when it comes down to it, if that law is not monitored so that you can catch violations and then enforced through, adjudicating whether there is a violation or not, and if there is, applying deterrent sanctions, then the companies will continue to thumb their noses at the law. It's really important. And I think when the first code status report was done by WHO, UNICEF, and IPFAN, I think in 2016, they really focused on this because they were noticing that very few countries had monitoring systems in place. You need to have a monitoring system that is kind of ongoing so that you're catching violations as they happen. So that needs to be a kind of part of the whole implementation process. You need to set up that monitoring system using preferably monitoring systems that are already in place in countries, whether that be Food and Drug Administration or your environmental health inspectors or whatever. It's really important. But what they found at that time that this was not happening. So they came up with something that is called Netcode, which is a network of organizations sort of dedicated to trying to assist governments in improving implementation. And there are actually protocols available to help with that. And WHO and UNICEF and some of the other NGO partners have been trying to promote this with, varying degrees of success. But still to this day, there are very few countries that have this kind of systematic monitoring in place. And I actually think that accessing more information about violations, the levels of violations, the prevalence of violations is going to help us make the case, because we can show in countries that have good laws that score well on the code status report, the latest 2022 report that came out earlier this year, countries that score very well, we know that there are still violations happening. We hear reports of them. But if we can have more evidence of that to be able to go to government and say, look, you've done a good job in getting this legislation in place, but it's really not worth very much if you're not monitoring and enforcing it. Mm-hmm. And we have the tools to assist you. We have the protocols. We can help you in doing that. I think that's going to be very important. Often when we're talking about monitoring and success, we point to India, which has a system in place to the extent that the government, when it introduced its code legislation, nominated 2 consumer protection organizations to be the code monitors. And over the years, they have found violations, reported violations, and there have been consequences for the companies involved. And I think there's a famous chart that goes around that was developed by Euromonitor a few years ago. It was actually to try and show the difference in the sales of infant formula in a country with good legislation, and they chose India. And we know that there was implementation and enforcement in India, where the sales of infant formula were stagnant because there was no opportunity for the companies to be advertising, promoting the way that they do in other countries, as compared with China, where there was really very, very little regulation at that time. That has got even weaker over time. This was sort of evidence that the code, if it's well drafted, if it's implemented and enforced, it does make a huge difference. So, as I say, I think we need to all keep pushing and pushing for better monitoring and enforcement. And I feel that having more evidence of violations just makes our case stronger to show that women and babies are not being protected the way they should be, the way is their right. All of the countries that have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, they're under an obligation to protect infants, to protect families from false information about infant young child feeding. So we really need to make that case.
And also, that's something that you are still working very hard on. Even after you retired from UNICEF, you continue to fight this fight and work very, very hard on.
Well, it's if we can't do this for the most vulnerable members of our communities, of our countries, babies, newborn babies, I mean, it's worth continuing to fight for them. And so, Constance, I'd like to take an opportunity to ask you another question. You know, I mentioned before about my own experience about how digital marketing is targeted at individuals. You know, the baby food industry is really targeting pregnant women and new mothers who are at really their most vulnerable. And you've pointed out how they can prey on their insecurities, etc. So I'm curious to know how, you know, this new technology that you're using manages to pick up on these promotional practices.
So we've built an AI model. To train the machine is actually an ongoing process. So from the start, we actually feed the machine with countless links. We've consulted partners in the countries that we are doing monitoring in. So for now, we are covering Australia, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Nigeria, Philippines, Singapore, UK, USA, and Vietnam. With Vietnam is actually a model that's built according to the national law, not the international code. We actually have to crop out the text and the messages to teach the machine. So the text and the messages basically are on the claims that we talked about, building immunity, and especially that's something that really tug at the parents and the mother's heartstring during the pandemic, when we, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, we knew nothing about COVID. And we just wanted to have anything that helps. And with babies that are born into the pandemic. So a lot of the marketing we are seeing that is actually focused on boasting the immunity building properties of the products, and also the brain development, intelligence, better digestive system is a big one. So we're picking all these claims and messages up in our monitoring through the auto detection system. Also idealizing content, making the product comparable to breast milk, comparing the products with breast milk, saying that the product has properties that are just as good or even better than breast milk. And through digital platforms, especially social media, companies are offering chat rooms, support groups online, counseling chat lines to offer support and advice, and just somebody to talk to. As you know, pregnant women, they really want someone to talk to them, to talk about all the questions or the concerns that they have. They may not always be able to have access to healthcare professionals or the doctors at all times. So, you know, a mother may be staying up at night thinking about, oh, what's going on when my baby is crying nonstop, you know, for hours. Is he or she okay? And in that nick of time, they really need to just get online or get into a chat room and be able to talk to somebody. So we're picking all these trends up. And another thing is also we've built the model to be able to detect marketing of milk for pregnant women and lactating mothers. That's a product that's really big in Asia. And as a matter of fact, in Vietnam, there was a study done recently that many mothers think that it is actually a norm to use these products. And the product actually would help the baby to become stronger and smarter. We know that, you know, the concept of brand loyalty, once we have used something and started something that we think is good for us or for our baby, it is very likely that mothers will just continue on with the same brand or the same company, thinking that the product will just continue to be good for the babies. If it's doing good for me when I'm pregnant, the packaging and the labels are all in the same line, you know, the design, the colors, everything look the branding is just spectacularly similar. So when you use one product, it's just a natural inclination to continue on to use the subsequent products in the same line. So yeah, so all these are the things that we are picking up from our auto detection.
Well, that's great. As I mentioned, it's going to be really helpful, I think, to have this evidence to back up our calls for better protection for mothers and babies.